My name is Pierce Sterling, and I used to think the worst thing about being underestimated was the loneliness. I was wrong. The worst thing is watching people plot your destruction right in front of you, assuming you're too stupid to understand what's happening. It started on a Tuesday morning in our glass-walled house in Newton, Massachusetts. Helena was at the kitchen island, perfectly manicured fingers wrapped around her third espresso of the day, scrolling through her phone with that predatory smile she wore when gossip was particularly juicy. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible Reddit stories. "Oh my God, Mara, you're absolutely right," she said into her wireless earbuds, not bothering to lower her voice. "Pierce just sits in that little office all day, clicking buttons on his computer. I swear, I don't know why I married someone so ordinary." I continued reading the Wall Street Journal, my face carefully neutral. After 16 years of marriage, I'd perfected the art of invisible presence. Helena had no idea I could hear every word through her supposedly private conversations. "No, seriously," she continued, examining her reflection in the black granite countertop. "He makes maybe $40,000 a year doing whatever it is he does. Some kind of data entry for an investment firm. Meanwhile, I'm building an actual business with the boutique." Her boutique. 3 years ago, I'd quietly transferred $200,000 from my trading account to help her lease the space on Newberry Street. She'd never asked where the money came from, just assumed it was some kind of inheritance or loan. Helena had always been remarkably incurious about the details of my work. "Donovan says I could get everything in a divorce," she whispered, thinking she was being discreet. "The house, the cars, probably alimony, too. Pierce is so passive. He'd probably just sign whatever papers I put in front of him." Donovan Price, her divorce attorney. I'd met him exactly once at a charity function last spring. Tall, silver-haired, expensive suit, the kind of man who shook hands like he was already calculating how much you were worth to him. Helena had introduced him as her legal advisor for the business, but I'd caught the way their fingers lingered when they touched, the private jokes, the meaningful glances. I folded my newspaper and stood up, carrying my coffee mug to the sink. Helena glanced at me with mild irritation, as if my movement had interrupted something important. "I have to go to work," I said quietly. She murmured, already turning back to her phone. "Don't forget we have dinner with the Richardsons on Friday. Try to wear something nice for once." I nodded and grabbed my keys from the hook by the garage door. As I backed my modest Honda Civic out of the driveway, I could see Helena through the kitchen window, animated and laughing at whatever Mara was saying. She looked genuinely happy, probably for the first time in months. The drive to downtown Boston gave me time to think. My office building was a sleek glass tower on Federal Street, home to Meridian Capital Management. I'd been working there for 8 years, starting as a junior quantitative analyst and slowly, quietly, working my way up through the ranks. Helena had never visited my office. She'd never met my colleagues. She'd never asked about my day-to-day responsibilities or shown any interest in the technical aspects of high-frequency trading. To her, I was just Pierce, the quiet husband who paid the bills and stayed out of her way, which was exactly how I preferred it. I badged into the building and took the elevator to the 32nd floor. The trading floor was already buzzing with activity, dozens of monitors displaying real-time market data, algorithms executing thousands of transactions per second. My corner office overlooked Boston Harbor, a view that had cost the firm nearly $2 million in premium rent. "Morning, Pierce," called Sarah Chen, one of our senior portfolio managers. "Ready for the quarterly review?" I nodded and settled into my chair, pulling up the performance reports I'd been preparing for weeks. Meridian Capital Management specialized in algorithmic trading strategies, using complex mathematical models to identify and exploit market inefficiencies. It was highly technical work that required advanced degrees in mathematics and computer science, the kind of specialized knowledge that commanded premium compensation in the financial industry. My base salary was $680,000 per year, plus performance bonuses that had averaged another $300,000 annually for the past 3 years. Last month, I'd been promoted to senior partner, a position that came with equity stakes and profit-sharing arrangements that would likely double my total compensation within 2 years. I hadn't told Helena about the promotion yet. I hadn't told her about most of my professional achievements, actually. Somehow, it had become easier to let her maintain her illusions about my little office job than to correct her assumptions. But as I listened to her planning my financial destruction over breakfast, I realized that my policy of benign neglect might need to change. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Saw your wife and her lawyer friend at the Mandarin Oriental yesterday afternoon. Thought you should know. A friend. I stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it. But the damage was done. The careful equilibrium I'd maintained for years was starting to crack, and I could feel something cold and analytical taking its place. I opened a new document on my computer and began typing, Documentation Log, Day 1. The Mandarin Oriental Hotel sat like a gleaming monument to discretion in the heart of Back Bay, exactly the kind of place where Boston's elite conducted their most private business. I'd walked past it hundreds of times over the years, never imagining I'd one day be sitting in my car across the street, watching my wife emerge from the lobby with another man's hand on her lower back. It was Thursday afternoon, 2 days after the mysterious text message. I'd told my assistant I had an off-site meeting and driven to the hotel district, not really expecting to find anything. Helena had mentioned having a business lunch with potential investors for the boutique. I'd assumed it was legitimate. I was wrong. Helena appeared first, checking her reflection in the glass doors before stepping onto the sidewalk. She wore the black dress I'd bought her for our anniversary last year, her hair perfectly styled, lips freshly painted. She looked radiant, glowing with the kind of satisfaction I hadn't seen on her face in months. Donovan emerged 30 seconds later, adjusting his tie and scanning the street with the practiced caution of a man who'd done this before. He was even more polished than I remembered from the charity event. Expensive suit, Italian shoes, the kind of effortless confidence that came from never having to worry about money. They didn't kiss goodbye, but the intimacy between them was unmistakable. The way Helena tilted her head when he whispered something in her ear. The possessive gesture he made, straightening her necklace. The lingering look they shared before walking in opposite directions. I sat in my car for another 20 minutes, processing what I'd witnessed. Then I drove home and began planning my response. The next morning, I called in a favor from Nina Rodriguez, an old college friend who now worked in cybersecurity consulting. Nina had always been brilliant with technology, the kind of person who could extract information from digital breadcrumbs that most people didn't even know they were leaving behind. "You want me to do what exactly?" Nina asked when I explained the situation over coffee at a small cafe in Cambridge. "Nothing illegal," I assured her. "I just need to understand the scope of what I'm dealing with. Helena uses our shared home Wi-Fi for everything. Her emails, her calendar, her financial accounts. If she's planning to divorce me, I have a right to know what she's telling her attorney." Nina studied my face carefully. We'd known each other for 20 years, since our graduate school days at MIT. She was one of the few people who understood both my technical background and my personal situation. "This is about more than just an affair, isn't it?" she said finally. "Helena thinks I'm some kind of low-level office worker," I replied. "She's planning to take me for everything I'm worth, except she has no idea what I'm actually worth. Her lawyer is encouraging her to be aggressive because he assumes I'm financially vulnerable. And you want to let them dig their own grave." "Something like that." Nina smiled, the first genuine emotion I'd seen from anyone in weeks. "You know what? I always thought Helena was a piece of work. Give me a few days." 3 days later, Nina handed me a USB drive containing 6 months of Helena's digital communications. Email threads with Donovan discussing strategy sessions that were clearly personal meetings, calendar entries for legal consultations that coincided with hotel reservations, text messages with her friend Mara plotting how to maximize her divorce settlement. But the most damaging evidence was a series of emails between Helena and Donovan discussing his other clients' cases, sharing confidential information that violated attorney-client privilege. Donovan had been using insider knowledge from his divorce practice to advise Helena on tactics and timing, a clear ethical violation that could cost him his law license. I spent the weekend reading through everything, building a comprehensive timeline of their affair and documenting every instance of professional misconduct. Helena spent the same weekend at a spa retreat with Mara, which according to her credit card statements was actually another hotel rendezvous with Donovan. On Monday morning, I made 2 phone calls. The first was to Margaret Foster, the best family law attorney in Boston and Donovan's primary professional rival. The second was to the Massachusetts Board of Bar Overseers, requesting information about filing ethics complaints against practicing attorneys. Then I went to work and waited. Helena returned from her spa weekend, refreshed and energetic, full of stories about meditation sessions and detox treatments that had supposedly taken place at a resort that didn't actually offer those services. She was getting sloppy, overconfident in her deception. "I've been thinking," she announced over dinner Tuesday night. "Maybe we should talk to someone about our relationship. Get some professional guidance." "You mean like a marriage counselor?" I asked. "Well, not exactly. More like someone who could help us figure out what we both really want. I have a friend who specializes in these kinds of situations." Her friend, Donovan Price, who was planning to represent her in divorce proceedings while simultaneously sleeping with her. The conflict of interest was so blatant, it was almost comical. "That sounds like a good idea," I said. "Why don't you set something up?" Helena's face lit up with surprise and relief. She'd expected resistance, argument, emotional drama. Instead, I was making it easy for her, walking directly into the trap she was setting. "Really? You're okay with that?" "Helena, I want you to be happy. If talking to a professional will help, then we should definitely do it." She reached across the table and squeezed my hand, the first affectionate gesture she'd made in months. "I'm so glad you're being reasonable about this, Pierce. I was worried you might make things difficult." I squeezed back, smiling. Why would I make things difficult? We're on the same team, right? That night, Helena made 3 phone calls from her home office, door closed, but voice carrying through the thin walls. The first was to Donovan, confirming their consultation for Friday afternoon. The second was to Mara, giggling about how easy I was being. The third was to her bank, asking about procedures for separating joint accounts. I recorded all 3 conversations from my workshop in the basement, using equipment I'd originally bought for analyzing audio patterns in market data. The recordings wouldn't be admissible in court, but they gave me perfect intelligence about Helena's timeline and strategy. She was planning to file for divorce the following Monday, immediately after our consultation with Donovan. She expected to catch me completely off guard, to present me with papers demanding immediate separation of assets and temporary alimony while the case proceeded through the courts. What Helena didn't know was that I'd already filed my own divorce petition with Margaret Foster, citing adultery and requesting enforcement of our prenuptial agreement's infidelity clause. The papers were sealed, waiting for my signal to proceed. What she also didn't know was that I'd spent the past week quietly transferring assets into protected accounts, documenting the source of every dollar to prove it was my separate property, earned through my individual professional efforts. By Thursday evening, I was ready. Helena was walking into Friday's meeting thinking she held all the cards. Instead, she was about to discover that she'd been playing against a stacked deck from the very beginning. The only question was whether Donovan was smart enough to recognize the trap before it closed around both of them. Friday afternoon arrived with the kind of crisp October clarity that made Boston look like a postcard. I sat in my office, watching the harbor traffic through floor-to-ceiling windows, while Helena prepared for what she thought would be the opening salvo of her victorious divorce campaign. At 2:47 p.m., my phone buzzed with a text from Helena. "Meeting with consultant running long. Don't wait up for dinner." I smiled and forwarded the message to Margaret Foster, along with a note, "Proceed as discussed." Donovan Price's law office occupied the top 3 floors of a historic brownstone on Commonwealth Avenue, the kind of old money address that charged premium rates for the privilege of mahogany paneling and Persian rugs. I'd driven past it twice over the past week, timing the security routines and noting the building's layout. At 4:15 p.m., I parked across the street and settled in to wait. Helena's BMW pulled up 20 minutes later. She checked her makeup in the rearview mirror, smoothed her skirt, and walked into the building with the confident stride of someone who believed she was about to become very wealthy. I gave them 30 minutes to get comfortable, then made my move. The building's lobby was elegant but poorly secured, relying more on prestige than actual protection. I walked past the distracted receptionist like I belonged there, took the elevator to the 3rd floor, and followed the sound of familiar laughter down a carpeted hallway. Donovan's corner office door was slightly ajar. Through the gap, I could see Helena perched on the edge of his desk, her hand resting on his thigh while he explained the divorce timeline. Legal documents were scattered across the mahogany surface, mixed with champagne glasses and what looked like celebratory chocolates. "The key is moving fast," Donovan was saying, his voice thick with wine and satisfaction. "Pierce seems completely clueless about what's coming. By the time he realizes what's happening, we'll have temporary orders in place for spousal support and asset preservation." "And you're sure the prenup won't be a problem?" Helena asked, trailing her finger along his tie. "Trust me, sweetheart. Prenups get thrown out all the time, especially when we can argue economic duress or inadequate legal representation. Your husband strikes me as the type who probably pressured you into signing without proper counsel." I pushed the door open and stepped into the room. "Actually," I said quietly, "my wife had excellent legal representation when she signed our prenuptial agreement. Margaret Foster handled the negotiations personally." Helena spun around so fast she nearly fell off the desk, her face cycling through confusion, shock, and dawning horror in the space of 3 seconds. Donovan's champagne glass slipped from his fingers and shattered against the hardwood floor. "Pierce!" Helena gasped. "What are you doing here?" "Learning about my wife's legal strategy," I replied, settling into one of Donovan's leather client chairs without invitation. "Please don't let me interrupt. This is fascinating." Donovan had recovered enough to attempt damage control. "Mr. Sterling, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Helena came to me for general advice about marital counseling resources. Nothing more." I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the photos Nina had helped me compile. Hotel receipts, restaurant bills, text message screenshots, calendar entries, documenting 6 months of systematic deception. "Marital counseling," I repeated thoughtfully. "Is that what you call it when you bill clients $300 an hour for afternoon meetings at the Mandarin Oriental?" Helena's face had gone completely white. "Pierce, I can explain." "I'm sure you can. You've always been creative with explanations." I stood up and walked to Donovan's desk, examining the scattered divorce papers. "Petition for dissolution of marriage, citing irreconcilable differences. Request for temporary spousal support in the amount of $8,000 per month. Motion to set aside prenuptial agreement based on claims of economic coercion." Donovan was sweating now, probably calculating how quickly he could distance himself from this situation. "Mr. Sterling, I want you to know that nothing inappropriate has occurred between your wife and myself. Our relationship has been strictly professional." I laughed, the sound echoing strangely in the high-ceilinged office. "Professional. That's an interesting word choice. considering you've been violating about 6 different ethics rules over the past 6 months. What are you talking about? Helena demanded, some of her confidence returning. I'm talking about your boyfriend here using confidential information from his other divorce cases to advise you on strategy. I'm talking about him representing you while simultaneously having a relationship with you, which creates an inherent conflict of interest. I'm talking about him billing you for legal services while actually providing escort services. Donovan shot to his feet, his face flushed with anger and panic. You can't prove any of that. Actually, I can. I pulled a manila envelope from my jacket and dropped it on his desk. 6 months of documentation, hotel records, credit card statements, email communications, phone logs, plus a formal complaint I filed with the Board of Bar Overseers this morning, requesting a full investigation into your professional conduct. Helena grabbed the envelope and started rifling through its contents, her hands shaking. You've been spying on me? I've been protecting myself, I corrected. You want to divorce me? Fine. But you're going to do it honestly, without committing fraud or violating the law. Donovan had gone completely silent, staring at the evidence scattered across his desk like a man watching his career evaporate in real time. There's something else you should know, I continued, enjoying the moment more than I'd expected. I've already filed my own divorce petition, citing adultery and requesting full enforcement of our prenuptial agreement. You'll be served with papers on Monday morning. Helena's voice came out as a strangled whisper. You can't do this. I already did. Margaret Foster is handling my case personally. I'm sure you remember her. She's the attorney who explained every clause of our prenup to you 16 years ago, including the section that voids all financial claims in the event of marital infidelity. The room fell silent except for the sound of Helena's ragged breathing and the distant traffic on Commonwealth Avenue. Donovan slumped back into his chair, probably contemplating the professional and personal wreckage I'd just delivered to his doorstep. How much? Helena asked suddenly. How much what? How much are you actually worth? Because if you can afford Margaret Foster, if you can afford to investigate me for 6 months, if you're this confident about the prenup— She trailed off, the implications finally sinking in. I smiled and headed for the door. You'll find out on Monday, along with everyone else. As I reached the hallway, I heard Helena start to cry, not the delicate tears she used for manipulation, but the harsh, ugly sobs of someone whose carefully constructed world had just collapsed around her. Donovan's voice followed me down the corridor. Helena, we need to talk about damage control. But it was too late for damage control. The trap had been set, sprung, and sealed. All that remained was watching them try to escape from a cage they'd built themselves. The Suffolk County Family Court building squatted like a concrete fortress on New Chardon Street, its brutalist architecture reflecting the grim realities of dissolved marriages and broken families. I arrived early Monday morning, carrying a leather briefcase that contained 16 years of financial records and the complete documentation of Helena's betrayal. Margaret Foster was waiting in the lobby, impeccably dressed in a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. At 62, she was a legend in Massachusetts family law, known for her surgical precision in high-stakes divorce cases and her absolute intolerance for deception. Pierce, she said, extending a perfectly manicured hand. Are you ready for this? I've been ready for months. We took the elevator to the 3rd floor, where Helena and Donovan were already huddled outside courtroom 3B, speaking in urgent whispers. Helena looked like she hadn't slept since Friday afternoon. Dark circles under her eyes, hair slightly disheveled, hands trembling as she clutched a cup of coffee. Donovan appeared marginally more composed, but I could see the stress in the tight lines around his mouth and the way he kept checking his phone, probably hoping for some miracle that would salvage his reputation. Mr. Price, Margaret said pleasantly as we approached. "I was surprised to see your name on the opposing counsel documents. I thought you specialized in corporate law these days." Donovan's jaw tightened. "I've been expanding my practice to include family matters." "How interesting. And Ms. Sterling, you look lovely as always. I trust you remember our conversations about the prenuptial agreement all those years ago?" Helena's response was barely audible. "I remember. Judge Patricia Morrison called our case at exactly 9:30 a.m. Judge Morrison was a no-nonsense woman in her late 50s, known throughout the Boston legal community for her sharp intellect and complete immunity to emotional manipulation. She'd been presiding over family court for 15 years and had seen every possible variation of marital breakdown. "This is a petition for dissolution of marriage filed by Pierce Sterling against Helena Sterling," Judge Morrison announced, scanning the initial paperwork. "I see we have competing petitions filed within days of each other. Mr. Price, your client filed first?" "Yes, Your Honor. Mrs. Sterling is seeking dissolution based on irreconcilable differences, along with temporary spousal support and a review of the prenuptial agreement's validity." "And Ms. Foster?" "Mr. Sterling is seeking dissolution based on adultery, Your Honor, with full enforcement of the existing prenuptial agreement's infidelity clause." Judge Morrison's eyebrows rose slightly. "I see. This should be interesting. Mr. Price, call your first witness." Helena took the stand with the determined air of someone who'd rehearsed this moment extensively. Donovan walked her through the standard narrative: years of growing apart, Pierce's emotional unavailability, his failure to contribute meaningfully to their lifestyle or social standing. "Mrs. Sterling," Donovan said, his voice carrying the practiced sympathy of a seasoned performer, "can you describe your husband's attitude toward your marriage and your personal ambitions?" Helena straightened in her chair, finding her rhythm. "Pierce has always been disconnected. He spends all day in his little office doing some kind of computer work that he never explains. He makes barely enough to cover basic expenses, so I've had to build my own business just to maintain any kind of decent lifestyle." "And how would you characterize his earning capacity?" "Minimal. He works for some investment company, but it's clearly just a low-level position. Data entry, maybe basic analysis. Nothing that requires real skill or education." I watched Judge Morrison's face carefully as Helena spoke. The judge was taking notes, but her expression remained neutral. "Mrs. Sterling," Donovan continued, "in your opinion, what would be a fair distribution of marital assets, given your respective contributions to the household?" Helena's confidence was building now, feeding off what she perceived as a sympathetic audience. "I think I should receive the house, since I'm the one who's actually maintained it and made it a home, plus reasonable spousal support while I rebuild my life. Pierce has never really supported my dreams or ambitions. He's just there, taking up space." "And what amount of spousal support do you believe would be appropriate?" $8,000 per month seems fair, considering what I'll need to maintain a basic standard of living." Judge Morrison looked up from her notes. "Mrs. Sterling, you're asking for $8,000 monthly from a husband you've described as earning a minimal salary?" Helena faltered for just a moment. "Well, he'll have to figure it out. Maybe get a better job, show some ambition for once." "I see. Mr. Price, do you have additional questions for your client?" Donovan glanced at me nervously before continuing. "Mrs. Sterling, has your husband ever been abusive or controlling in any way?" "Absolutely. He's emotionally unavailable, dismissive of my needs, completely unsupportive of my business ventures. He just sits in his basement office all day, ignoring his responsibilities as a husband." Judge Morrison's pen stopped moving. "Mrs. Sterling, you just described your husband as both financially inadequate and emotionally neglectful. Yet you're seeking substantial ongoing financial support from this same man you characterize as worthless?" Helena's face reddened. Well, he has obligations. Legal obligations." Based on what earning capacity? He'll have to find a way. Maybe he can finally get serious about his career instead of just coasting. The courtroom fell silent for a moment. Judge Morrison set down her pen and studied Helena with the expression of someone trying to solve a particularly complex puzzle. Ms. Foster, you may cross-examine. Margaret stood gracefully, buttoning her suit jacket. Mrs. Sterling, you've testified that your husband makes barely enough to cover basic expenses. What do you believe his annual salary to be? I don't know exactly. Maybe 30 or 40,000? He's never been very forthcoming about the details. And you've been married for 16 years? Yes. In 16 years, you've never seen a tax return, a pay stub, or any other documentation of your husband's income. Helena shifted uncomfortably. Pierce handles all the financial paperwork. He says it's too complicated for me to worry about. Yet you're confident enough in your assessment of his earning capacity to demand $8,000 monthly in spousal support? He can get a better job if he needs to. Margaret walked to the plaintiff's table and retrieved a manila folder. Your Honor, I'd like to introduce Exhibits A through D, Mr. Sterling's tax returns for the past 4 years, certified by his accounting firm, his employment contract with Meridian Capital Management, his promotion letter to senior partner dated 6 weeks ago, and a letter from Meridian's HR department confirming his current compensation package. Judge Morrison accepted the documents and began reviewing them, her expression growing more incredulous with each page. Mrs. Sterling, Margaret continued, did you know that your husband holds advanced degrees in mathematics and computer science from MIT? What? Did you know that he specializes in quantitative analysis and algorithmic trading strategies? Helena's voice was barely a whisper. I don't understand. Did you know that his little office job involves managing investment portfolios worth hundreds of millions of dollars? That's impossible. Judge Morrison looked up from the financial documents. Mr. Sterling, please stand. I rose from my seat, feeling the weight of 16 years of carefully maintained silence. Mr. Sterling, Judge Morrison said, her voice carrying a note of amazement. According to these documents, your annual compensation is $680,000, with performance bonuses averaging an additional $300,000 per year. Is that correct? Yes, Your Honor. The courtroom erupted. Helena gasped so loudly it echoed off the walls, her hand flying to her mouth. Donovan dropped his legal pad, papers scattering across the floor. Several spectators in the gallery started whispering frantically. Wait, Helena whispered, her face completely drained of color. How much? $680,000, Judge Morrison repeated clearly, plus bonuses. Mr. Sterling, why didn't you correct your wife's characterization of your income during her testimony? Your Honor, my wife has never asked about my work or shown any interest in my professional achievements. I saw no reason to volunteer information she'd never requested. Helena was staring at me like I'd suddenly sprouted a second head. But you drive a Honda. You wear cheap clothes. You never spend money on anything. I prefer to live below my means, I replied calmly. I find it keeps life simple. Judge Morrison set the financial documents aside and fixed Helena with a stern look. Mrs. Sterling, you've just spent 30 minutes testifying under oath that your husband is financially worthless and professionally inadequate. Now we discover he earns more than most physicians and attorneys. Would you like to revise any of your previous statements? Helena's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, like a fish gasping for air. Furthermore, Judge Morrison continued, I'm looking at a prenuptial agreement that explicitly voids all financial claims in the event of marital infidelity. Ms. Foster, do you have evidence supporting the adultery allegations? Margaret smiled. Substantial evidence, Your Honor. As Margaret began presenting the hotel records, credit card statements, and photographic evidence of Helena's affair with Donovan, I watched my wife's face cycle through shock, denial, anger, and finally, devastating comprehension. She'd played herself perfectly, walking into a trap of her own making, and the best part was, she'd done it all under oath, in front of a judge who clearly had no patience for deception or greed. The game was over. Helena just didn't know it yet. The afternoon session resumed with Helena slumped in her chair like a deflated balloon, all her earlier confidence replaced by shell-shocked silence. Donovan had requested a brief recess to consult with his client, but I suspected he was actually trying to figure out how to minimize his own professional liability in what was rapidly becoming a complete disaster. Margaret Foster had spent the lunch break organizing her evidence with the methodical precision of a surgeon preparing for a complex operation. Hotel receipts, credit card statements, phone records, and surveillance photographs were arranged in neat stacks, each piece of documentation building an unassailable case for Helena's infidelity. "Your Honor," Margaret began, "I'd like to call Pierce Sterling to the stand." I walked to the witness box feeling oddly calm, considering I was about to publicly dissect 16 years of marriage. Judge Morrison administered the oath, and I settled into the chair, looking out at a courtroom that had filled with spectators during the lunch break. Word had apparently spread about the morning's revelations. "Mr. Sterling," Margaret said, "when did you first become aware of your wife's extramarital relationship?" "Approximately 6 months ago. I received an anonymous tip about Helena and Mr. Price meeting at the Mandarin Oriental Hotel during business hours." "And what was your response to this information?" "I began documenting their relationship to understand the full scope of the situation." Margaret walked me through the evidence methodically. The hotel meetings, the falsified business expenses, the intimate text messages, the coordinated lies about spa retreats and legal consultations. Each revelation hit Helena like a physical blow, her face growing paler with every detail. "Mr. Sterling," Margaret continued, "did you confront your wife about these discoveries?" "No. I wanted to see how far she was willing to take the deception." "And what did you learn?" I glanced at Helena, who was staring at me with a mixture of horror and fascination. "I learned that my wife was planning to divorce me based on fraudulent claims about my earning capacity, while simultaneously conducting an affair with the attorney she intended to use against me." "How did that make you feel?" For the first time since this whole ordeal began, I allowed genuine emotion to creep into my voice. Disappointed. Not surprised exactly, but deeply disappointed. I'd spent 16 years trying to be a good husband, supporting Helena's dreams and ambitions, giving her space to build her own identity. I never imagined she viewed me with such contempt. Judge Morrison leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Sterling, why didn't you simply divorce your wife when you discovered the affair? Why allow this elaborate charade to continue?" I considered the question carefully. "Your Honor, Helena has spent years telling her friends that I'm weak, passive, financially inadequate. She's built her entire social identity around the idea that she married beneath her station. I wanted her to understand the consequences of those assumptions." "And Mr. Price's role in this situation?" "Mr. Price encouraged Helena's deception because he believed I was an easy target. He saw an opportunity to manipulate a vulnerable woman and extract maximum financial benefit from what he assumed would be a straightforward divorce proceeding." Donovan shot to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. That's speculation and character assassination." Judge Morrison's expression could have frozen water. "Mr. Price, you're representing a client with whom you're having an intimate relationship, while using confidential information from other cases to advise her on divorce strategy. I don't think you're in a position to object to character assassination." Donovan sank back into his chair, his face flushed with embarrassment and growing panic. Margaret introduced her final piece of evidence, a recording of Helena's phone conversation with Mara, discussing her plans to take Pierce for everything he's worth, because he was too stupid and passive to fight back. As Helena's voice filled the courtroom, describing me as a pathetic loser, who deserved to be cleaned out. I watched her realize that her own words were sealing her fate. "Mrs. Sterling," Judge Morrison said when the recording ended, "do you recognize that conversation?" Helena's voice was barely audible. "Yes." "And were you accurately representing your feelings about your husband and your intentions regarding this divorce?" Helena looked desperately at Donovan, but he was staring at his hands, probably contemplating the ethics complaint that would likely end his career. I was angry. I said things I didn't mean." "Mrs. Sterling, you've been conducting an affair for 6 months, lying to your husband about your activities, plotting to defraud him in divorce proceedings, and describing him in the most contemptuous terms possible to anyone who would listen. Which part of that behavior was motivated by temporary anger?" Helena began crying, but these weren't the calculated tears she'd used for manipulation throughout our marriage. These were the raw, desperate sobs of someone watching her carefully constructed world collapse in real time. "Your Honor," Margaret said, "given the clear evidence of adultery and the explicit terms of the prenuptial agreement, we request full enforcement of the infidelity clause, denial of all spousal support claims, and an equitable distribution of assets based on separate property documentation." Judge Morrison spent several minutes reviewing the prenuptial agreement, occasionally glancing up at Helena with an expression of barely concealed disgust. "The court finds clear and convincing evidence of adultery," Judge Morrison announced. "The prenuptial agreement is valid and enforceable. Mrs. Sterling's claims for spousal support are denied in their entirety. Mr. Sterling will retain all separate property acquired through his individual earnings, including the marital residence, investment accounts, and other assets documented as separate property." Helena's sobs intensified, but Judge Morrison wasn't finished. "Furthermore, the court is deeply troubled by the conduct of opposing counsel in this matter. Mr. Price, you will be receiving a formal referral to the Board of Bar Overseers regarding your professional conduct. Representing a client with whom you're having an intimate relationship while using that relationship to manipulate divorce proceedings represents a serious violation of ethical standards." Donovan looked like he might vomit. "Mrs. Sterling," Judge Morrison continued, "you have engaged in systematic deception, adultery, and attempted fraud. You have shown contempt for your marriage, your husband, and this court. You will receive no financial support from these proceedings, and you should consider yourself fortunate that criminal charges are not being pursued for attempted fraud." The gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo forever in the suddenly silent courtroom. Helena sat motionless for several seconds, then turned to stare at me with an expression I'd never seen before. A mixture of fear, respect, and dawning comprehension. "Pierce," she whispered, "I never knew." I stood up, straightened my tie, and looked down at the woman who'd spent 16 years underestimating me. "That," I said quietly, "was the point." As I walked out of the courtroom with Margaret Foster, I could hear Helena's voice behind me, pleading with Donovan to fix this somehow. But there was nothing left to fix. The margin call had come due, and Helena had discovered she was completely leveraged with no assets to cover her position. The game was over, and for the first time in years, I had won decisively.